Case 2. Who speaks when the apostles are silent? Some debates in theology do not begin with images, they begin with authority. Who may bind the conscience, and who may not? The question is not first about art, it is about obligation, what the apostles delivered, and what the church may require. The claim examined here is precise, that the veneration of icons is not merely permitted, it is necessary. But necessity demands authority, and authority demands origin. Before a practice can bind the conscience of the church, it must be shown to possess apostolic foundation. That is the issue. Not whether icons may exist, not whether they may be appreciated, not whether they may be useful. The question is whether they may be imposed as a universal obligation. The Christian faith originates with Christ, and Christ entrusted his revelation to the apostles. The church receives what the apostles delivered. It preserves, it teaches, it defends, but it does not stand above the apostolic deposit. This principle appears repeatedly in the Fathers. Irenaeus speaks of the completeness of apostolic transmission. Cyprian insists that necessity cannot be imposed apart from divine authority. Athanasius warns against adding to what has been received. Their language differs. Their conclusion does not. The church is a steward of revelation, not its source. From this follows an important principle. The burden of proof rests upon those who would impose an obligation. A practice may be ancient, it may be widespread, it may be spiritually beneficial. Yet none of these qualities by themselves establish apostolic necessity. If something is required of all Christians, its authority must be traceable to apostolic teaching. This brings us to the question of silence. The apostles taught extensively concerning doctrine, worship, discipline, and the life of the church. Yet nowhere do they clearly command the veneration of icons as a universal obligation. Silence does not necessarily forbid a practice, but neither does silence create a command. A practice may be lawful without being mandatory, beneficial without being binding. The absence of prohibition is not the same thing as the presence of obligation. What has not been transmitted as necessary cannot automatically become necessary through later assertion. If icon veneration belongs to the apostolic deposit, one would expect to find evidence of that obligation in the earliest generations of the church. The evidence is less straightforward. The early centuries reveal diversity. Acceptance in some places, resistance in others, development across time. Two figures are especially important in this discussion: Basil of Caesarea and Epiphanius of Salamis. Defenders of icon veneration often appeal to Basil's statement that the honor given to an image passes to its prototype. At first hearing, the statement appears to support the veneration of sacred images. Yet in its original context, Basil was not discussing icons. He was explaining the relationship between the Son and the Father. His argument belongs to Trinitarian theology. The Son is the image of the Father. Honor given to the Son passes to the Father, whom he perfectly reveals. Only later would Basil's language be applied within debates concerning images. This does not invalidate that later application. It simply means that Basil himself was not presenting icon veneration as an apostolic obligation. Epiphanius provides a different kind of evidence. Near the end of the 4th century, he entered a church and discovered an image displayed there. Believing such images to be inappropriate in a church, he removed it and instructed that similar images should not be displayed. Whether one agrees with his action is not the central point. The significance lies elsewhere. A bishop could take such action publicly and openly without believing he was violating a universally recognized apostolic requirement. His conduct reveals that the status of images was not understood everywhere in the same way. Together, these witnesses illuminate the landscape of the early church. Basil provides language that would later be used in support of icon theology. Epiphanius demonstrates that significant resistance to images could still exist among respected bishops. The result is not a picture of universal agreement. It is a picture of diversity. Reflection about images is present, debate about images is present, development concerning images is present. What is not clearly present is a universally acknowledged apostolic obligation requiring all Christians to venerate them. At this point, the strongest counter-argument must be considered. Defenders of icon veneration do not normally argue that later councils invented the practice. Rather, they argue that the councils recognized what the church had always possessed. This is a serious claim. but it shifts the question rather than resolving it. The issue remains whether the obligation itself can be traced to apostolic origin. The evidence may support historical development. It does not by itself establish apostolic necessity. This distinction is crucial. Permission and obligation are not the same thing. A practice may be lawful without being required. It may be valued without being mandatory. The burden of proof for permission is relatively light. The burden of proof for obligation is much heavier. For obligation binds the conscience, and only apostolic authority possesses the right to bind the conscience of the universal church. Councils therefore play an important but limited role. They clarify, they defend, they articulate, but they do not possess authority independent of the apostolic witness. The measure of every later judgment remains the faith once delivered. A council may affirm a practice, yet before that practice can become obligatory, its apostolic foundation must first be demonstrated. The same principle governs the question of development. Authentic development unfolds what is already present. It clarifies what has already been received. Innovation introduces a requirement that cannot be shown to arise from apostolic teaching. The question is not whether tradition develops. The question is whether a particular obligation can be shown to belong to the apostolic deposit. In the case of obligatory icon veneration, that demonstration remains disputed. The argument therefore returns to its starting point. The issue is not whether icons may be honored. The issue is whether Christians may be required to honor them. The evidence may support the existence of the practice. It does not clearly establish its status as a universal apostolic obligation. The apostolic transmission of that obligation has not been demonstrated. Therefore, the obligation itself cannot be imposed as necessary. The question before the church is ultimately a question of authority. Who has the right to bind the conscience, and on what basis? Where the apostles speak, the church listens. Where apostolic obligation has not been demonstrated, Christian liberty remains. The church lives from what it has received. It does not create new necessities of faith. It does not transform devotion into command. It does not elevate historical development into apostolic requirement. The apostolic deposit remains the measure. The apostolic witness remains the standard. Beyond that boundary, the conscience is free.